So I have all of this plywood cut for my office cabinets. I don't really want to work on that right now. I will. Just don't want to do it today. If you wanted to check those out when they are finally done, you can check those out up here. But that won't be for a little while yet, for me anyway. It might be up for you. So instead of working on that, I picked up some walnut yesterday. Let's do something with that. That seems more fun to me right now.
To start this project off, I measured out and sliced off a couple 18-inch segments of the walnut board over at the miter saw, followed by the 2x2 scraps where I cut 12 around 6-inch length segments. Then, since I'm going to be gluing the two 18-inch segments together, I throw each of them in the hand screw clamp I have screwed into the workbench and planed the two mating surfaces flat. I could have used the actual vise I installed in the workbench literally 6 inches that way, but this one was already here from another project, so why not? The hand plane didn't get them all of the way flat, probably user error, but got them close enough, so I fine-tuned them with the table saw. Usually that would go the other way around, but whatever. The last step before glue up was to run the two segments through the planer to make sure that they were both flat and the same thickness. And just a side note for you guys, if you are having trouble with your planer and it keeps blowing the breaker, check your blades.
I'm getting sick of this.
It only took me about 4 times before I figured I should check and took a break to rotate the carbide inserts. Shockingly enough, worked a whole lot better after that. With that done and still not being satisfied with the fit between the two halves, I break out and set up the jointer board, which finally did the job. And it's finally time for glue up. Just needed a little persuasion to make sure that everything was flat. While the panel was in clamps drying, I got my lathe set up and started turning the spindles, spools, whatever you want to call them. Basically, just mount the piece in the lathe, get it round, mark out the lengths, set the thicknesses on both ends and center. Wrenches make an easy way to make sure you have consistent thicknesses. Make sure that the rest of the material lines up with the already set thicknesses and distances. Knock off the end, little bit of sanding, then knock off the spool spindle from the remainder of the block. And finally, check to make sure that the spool spindle tenon fits into the bearing by fine-tuning with some sandpaper. Oh yeah, I'm mounting these spindles into bearings so that they spin a little easier. Repeat that process another 11 times. Because I was planning for 6, but wasn't 100% confident that they would look consistent enough. Not that it is that big of a deal in this situation, but also just in case I snapped the tenon off or something, I don't know. At this point the panel was dry and was able to come out of clamps, so out it came, and it was immediately attacked by the sander. 80 grit for now. With the sanding done, I figure out what I'm going to call center, drill out a little hole to hold the dental pick, figure out the length I'm going to need with the string line, and trace a circle around the panel. So yeah, this is going to be round. Taking the panel to the bandsaw, I start cutting it round, kinda spiraling it around to work my way up to, but not quite hitting the line. With the panel now round, I mount my sander in the vise I should have used for planing, and just spun it in place for a bit. Here's hoping it actually rounded it out a little bit more and didn't introduce more flat spots, but again, if it did, not that big of a deal. Since in theory the underside of this will never be seen, I did all of my marking on the underside of the panel, and with a 1/16 inch drill bit, I drilled out the 6 bearing locations through the bottom to the top. With the 6 holes exposed on the top face, I flip the panel around and drill out the mortises to the depth of the bearing with a Forstner bit, and then went through and sanded off all of the pencil marks. I thought at this point that the panel was a little bit chunky, so I threw a chamfer bit in the router and hit the top and bottom with it just to soften it up a little bit. Now to install the bearings. It worked quite well that the end of my quick connect for the air compressor hose was the same diameter as the inside of the bearings. So with a little bit of CA glue on the outside, I can drop it into the mortise, using a dental pick to hold the bearing in place while I pull the tire inflator back out. And then so I could continue working without getting glue on everything, I hit all of the bearings with some activator, sand the glue, squeeze out flush, and give everything another once over up to 220 grit. Next up was to install the Lazy Susan spinner ring thing, since this is going to be a Lazy Susan. Easy enough to install, I just drilled through the screw holes and screwed it down. Moving back to the spools, I just set the table saw blade to whatever height this is, and very carefully ran the top of the spool through the blade. Then they all needed a little bit more sanding, which I did by hand. Not sure why I did that right over top of the panel, getting even more dust in the bearings, but whatever. With them all cleaned up, it's time to install them, which is where I did a little bit of a screw up. To try and keep the spools in the bearings, I used CA glue again, but I also used activator. So far so good, right? Just wait. At this point, I was thinking the project was pretty much done other than finish, so I moved the Susan inside into my basement finishing room. Pretty standard procedure. Wipe off with a tack cloth, spray on a coat of finish, wait for a bit, flip over and remove the Lazy Susan ring, spray on another coat, light sanding with 320 grit once the first coat is dry, and repeat about 3 times. However, once I flipped it back around to the top side and sanded, I noticed that the areas around the spools where I used the activator hadn't cured properly and were still a little tacky. I tried to just layer coats over top to more or less build my way through the weirdness, but that didn't work and I eventually had to call it.
So apparently, when I glued the bearings in and I hit them with some activator to set the CA glue, I did have some overspray on all of them. The issue I'm having now is that the polyurethane here is not curing properly. It is still sticky to the touch, and I haven't touched this thing or put new polyurethane on it in over a week.
So, just so you all know, apparently activator stays active even when it's dry, and can mess with your finishes. Since I still wasn't happy with the finish, I ended up bringing the piece back out to the shop, pulling the spools out, sanded off the finish, and wiping down the top with some acetone. And back inside it goes to finish the top. So yesterday I sanded it down and put a coat of finish on it again. It's still a little tacky, so instead of putting another coat on now and rushing it like I did last time, I'm just going to let it dry for as long as it takes, because I don't see the same discoloration that I did have around the spindles as last time. So I'm just gonna let it go, see what happens. A month or so later, between multiple coats and straight up forgetting that this project existed for a little bit, I remembered that this was sitting in the stain room and figured I should check on it, and threw down the last coat of finish. The next day after the finish was dry, I hit everything with a 3000 grit sanding pad, wiped it all down with a tack cloth, popped the spools back into place, and now I can call this project done. This project took a little bit longer than I was expecting or wanting it to. The first round of finish going screwy on me definitely killed my motivation. Luckily, it was a relatively easy fix. However, now that it is done, Danielle has been using it to work on this blanket, and she has really enjoyed having the convenience of having multiple colors quickly accessible. I noticed while she was using it, the bearings for the spindles really weren't used all that much. The balls of yarn kind of just spun in place as opposed to spinning the spool. Although I suppose that is probably just the difference between stabbing the ball onto the spool as opposed to winding the yarn onto the spool. Either way, she's happy, so I'm happy. And with that, I'm going to call it a video. Thank you all for watching, and if you like what I'm doing here, give this video a thumbs up and subscribe for more. If you have any questions or comments, I look forward to reading them in the comment section below. And if you want to see more up-to-date projects, you can always follow me on Instagram at JohnTheShriner. Otherwise, I will see you here in the next video, and have a good one.